The champagne glass felt cold against my palm as I watched them from across the engagement party, my sister Victoria draped over my ex-fiancé Marcus like a designer dress she'd stolen from my closet. The irony was delicious. She had no idea she was celebrating in the very penthouse I'd bought under a shell company, drinking wine I'd selected, surrounded by flowers I'd arranged through my network of anonymous contacts. "Isn't it romantic?" Aunt Helen gushed beside me, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding. "Victoria and Marcus are just perfect together. It's like they were meant to be." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I forced a smile, the same practiced expression I'd worn for the past 6 months since discovering their affair. "They certainly deserve each other," I murmured, my words carrying a meaning she couldn't possibly understand. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. The discovery had come by accident, as the most devastating revelations often do. I'd returned early from a business trip to surprise Marcus for our 2nd anniversary, only to find Victoria's designer heels by his front door, the same Louboutins I'd bought her for her birthday 3 months earlier. The sounds coming from his bedroom had painted a picture no sister should ever have to witness, but I'd stood there in the hallway, my heart shattering as quietly as possible. But that betrayal, painful as it was, had only been the beginning. The real knife had twisted 2 weeks later when our family lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, had called with news about our grandmother's will. Nana Rose had passed away peacefully in her sleep, and I'd expected the reading to be a formality. She'd always favored me, her little entrepreneur as she called me. We'd spent countless hours discussing business, investments, and her impressive portfolio built over decades of careful planning. "I'm afraid there's been a change," Mr. Pemberton had said, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. "Your grandmother updated her will 3 weeks before her passing. The entire estate, the properties, investments, trust funds, everything now goes to Victoria." The world had tilted on its axis. "That's impossible. Nana would never." "I'm sorry, Emma." I tried to discourage her, but she was adamant. She said Victoria needed stability, that you were already successful enough on your own. That night, I'd sat in my apartment, my modest apartment, so different from the luxury Victoria enjoyed, trying to piece together how my grandmother could have been so thoroughly manipulated. The answer came in the form of Victoria's social media posts, carefully curated images of her visiting dear Nana in her final weeks, posts I'd been too busy with work to see. My sister had played the perfect granddaughter while I was building my consulting business, convincing our vulnerable elderly grandmother that I didn't need help, while Victoria, poor, struggling Victoria, deserved everything. Now, 6 months later, I watched Victoria flaunt both my inheritance and my ex-fiancé like trophies she'd won in some twisted competition I hadn't even known we were playing. "Emma, darling," Victoria's voice rang out across the party, saccharine sweet with just a hint of triumph. She glided toward me in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, a dress paid for with what should have been my inheritance. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight." Marcus followed behind her, his arm possessively around her waist. Once that gesture had been mine. Once I'd believed his promises about forever and building a life together. Now I could see what I'd been too blind to notice before, the calculating gleam in his eyes, the way he sized up everyone in terms of what they could offer him. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, raising my glass in a mock toast, "to new beginnings." Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment, as if sensing something beneath my words, but Marcus squeezed her closer and her confidence returned. "We're just so excited about the future," she gushed. "Marcus is moving into the penthouse next week. Nana's penthouse, I mean. It's going to be perfect for entertaining. We're thinking of hosting the wedding there too." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The penthouse had been Nana's pride and joy, a stunning space overlooking the city that she'd worked decades to afford. The thought of Marcus living there, of Victoria hosting parties with my grandmother's antique furniture and priceless art collection, made my stomach turn. "How thoughtful of you to honor Nana's memory," I said carefully. "She would have loved Marcus," Victoria continued, either missing or ignoring the edge in my voice. "She always said family was the most important thing." Family. The word felt bitter on my tongue. Victoria had no idea what family meant. She'd never worked for anything, never struggled, never had to build something from nothing. Everything had always been handed to her. The better grades through private tutors our parents couldn't really afford, the better opportunities through connections she'd never had to cultivate herself, and now the inheritance that should have been split between us. Speaking of family, Marcus interjected, his voice carrying that smooth charm that had once made me weak in the knees. We were hoping you'd be Victoria's maid of honor. It would mean so much to have your blessing. The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted me to stand beside them, to smile and celebrate while they built their future on the ruins of mine. But as I looked at their expectant faces, I realized something else. They genuinely believed they'd won. They thought I was beaten, broken, willing to accept whatever scraps of dignity they offered. I'd be honored, I lied smoothly, watching their relief and satisfaction. After all, sisters should stick together. As they moved on to greet other guests, I felt my phone buzz. A text from David Chen, my business partner and the only person who knew the full scope of what I'd been planning. Phase 1 is ready. Are you sure about this? I typed back quickly. They just asked me to be maid of honor, I'm sure. The truth was, I'd been planning this for months, ever since the night I'd learned about the will. While Victoria and Marcus had been busy spending my inheritance and planning their perfect life, I'd been doing what I did best, researching, investigating, and building a case. It had started with simple curiosity about how Victoria had managed to change Nana's will. A few carefully placed phone calls had revealed that she'd been visiting the law office regularly in those final weeks, accompanied by a man she'd introduced as her fiancé, the same man who, at the time, had been engaged to me. Further investigation had uncovered something even more interesting. Marcus wasn't just a charming investment banker. He was a predator with a specific type, young women with older, wealthy relatives. Victoria wasn't his first mark, just his most successful one so far. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo from the private investigator I'd hired. Marcus leaving his old apartment building with the last of his belongings. The timeline was perfect. He was officially moving in with Victoria tomorrow, which meant tonight was the last chance to plant what I needed in his old place. The party swirled around me as I excused myself to the bathroom, but instead of heading to the powder room, I slipped out onto the terrace. The city spread out below me, glittering with possibilities. Somewhere down there, my investigator was finishing the last phase of evidence collection. Somewhere else, David was preparing the documents that would change everything. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard last week when I'd accidentally arrived early to return Victoria's borrowed earrings. Marcus had been on the phone in the kitchen, his voice low but not low enough. "The old lady's money is just the beginning," he'd said. "Victoria's parents have another decade or two left, easy. And her sister's business is actually pretty successful. Did you know she cleared 7 figures last year? This family is a goldmine if you play it right." That's when I'd realized this wasn't just about love or even greed. This was Marcus's long-term business plan, and Victoria was just the first phase. The inheritance was meant to fund his lifestyle while he systematically worked his way through our entire family's assets. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated exactly how successful my business really was. And more importantly, he had no idea that I'd learned everything there was to know about his previous relationships and what had happened to those women when he was done with them. "Emma," Victoria's voice called from inside. "Everything okay?" I turned from the terrace, my mask of composed indifference firmly in place. "Just getting some air. Beautiful view from up here." "Isn't it?" She joined me outside, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Sometimes I can't believe this is all mine now. Nana was so generous." Generous, as if our grandmother had simply decided to cut me out of her will for no reason. As if months of manipulation and lies were just generosity. "She always wanted the best for us," I said carefully. Victoria nodded, her expression becoming almost wistful. "I know she worried about you, working so hard all the time. She said you needed to learn to rely on family more, to let other people take care of you for once." The manipulation was masterful. Victoria had convinced our grandmother that my independence was a flaw that needed correcting, that leaving me without the inheritance would somehow teach me to value family over work. She'd twisted Nana's love for me into a weapon against me. She was probably right. I lied. Maybe this will teach me to appreciate what really matters. Victoria squeezed my arm affectionately. "I'm so glad you understand. And don't worry, Marcus and I will make sure you're taken care of. Family has to stick together." The condescension in her voice was barely hidden. She genuinely believed she was doing me a favor, that accepting scraps from her table was the best I could hope for. It was almost amusing how completely she'd bought into Marcus's narrative that I was the poor, struggling sister who needed their charity. If only she knew that my struggling consulting business had just closed a deal worth 8 figures, or that I'd been systematically building a network of shell companies and offshore accounts for the past 3 years. If only she knew that everything they thought they understood about our family's finances was about to change. "We should get back inside," Victoria said, linking her arm through mine. "Marcus wants to announce our wedding date." As we walked back into the party, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, composed, supportive, the perfect sister celebrating her siblings' happiness. No one in that room could have guessed that I was mentally reviewing the timeline that would destroy everything Victoria and Marcus thought they'd built. The announcement came with champagne and applause. June 15th, just 3 months away. A summer wedding in the penthouse garden, overlooking the city where our grandmother had built her empire, one careful investment at a time. "To Victoria and Marcus," someone called out, raising their glass. "To love conquering all," another voice added. I raised my glass with the rest of them, my smile never wavering. But in my mind, I was already 3 months ahead, imagining a very different kind of celebration. After all, love might conquer all, but truth had a way of winning in the end. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Victoria pulled me aside one last time. "I know this might be hard for you," she said, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a caring whisper. "Seeing Marcus and me together, I mean. But I need you to know, we never meant for it to happen. It just did." The lie came so easily to her, so naturally, that I almost admired the skill involved. She'd rewritten history in her own mind, turning their calculated affair into a romantic fairy tale of inevitable love. "These things happen," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "I just want you to be happy." "I am," she said, her eyes shining with what looked like genuine emotion. "Happier than I've ever been. Marcus makes me feel so protected, so secure, like nothing bad could ever happen as long as he's with me." Protected, secure. The words she used to describe the man who was systematically planning to drain our family's resources and disappear when the well ran dry. The irony was almost too perfect. As I finally left the party and walked to my car, I pulled out my phone to check the evening's progress. 3 new messages waited for me. From the investigator. "Package delivered successfully. Subject will find it tomorrow." From David. "Legal documents are ready for filing Monday morning." From my accountant. "Transfers completed. All assets are now secure." I sat in my car for a moment, looking up at the penthouse where Victoria and Marcus were probably celebrating their perfect evening, planning their perfect wedding, building their perfect life on lies and stolen dreams. Tomorrow, Marcus would find the first surprise I'd left for him. Monday, the legal dominoes would begin to fall. By June 15th, their perfect wedding day, the only thing left to celebrate would be justice. But tonight I drove home to my modest apartment, the same space Victoria and Marcus probably pitied me for. They had no idea that this apartment was just one small piece of a much larger empire I'd built in shadows and silence. They couldn't have imagined that the struggling sister they dismissed had been playing a game they didn't even know existed. After all, while they'd been focused on stealing what was mine, I'd been busy making sure they'd have nothing left to steal. The real game was just beginning. Marcus found the package exactly where I'd planned, tucked behind his bathroom mirror in his old apartment, the one place he'd be sure to check during his final sweep before the movers arrived. The GPS tracker I'd placed on his car showed him sitting in the parking lot for 47 minutes after he was supposed to be at Victoria's penthouse, no doubt staring at the contents with growing horror. The package contained photographs, lots of them, Marcus with 3 different women over the past 5 years, each one wealthy, each one older relatives who'd conveniently died or transferred assets shortly after Marcus entered their lives. The most damning photo showed him at a coffee shop with a man named Vincent Torres, a known con artist who specialized in inheritance fraud. But the photographs were just the appetizer. The real meal was the flash drive containing bank records, email exchanges, and recorded phone conversations that painted a very clear picture of Marcus's business model. My private investigator had been thorough, perhaps more thorough than even I'd expected. "Emma, thank God you answered." Victoria's voice was strained when she called me at 11 that morning. "Something's wrong with Marcus. He's been acting strange all morning, checking his phone constantly, looking over his shoulder. I'm worried about him." I adjusted my position in the coffee shop across from the penthouse, my laptop open to surveillance feeds I'd installed months ago during a surprise visit while Victoria was out shopping. Through the cameras I could see Marcus pacing in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. Maybe he's just nervous about the move, I suggested, keeping my voice light with concern. Big changes can be stressful, even good ones. That's what I thought, but Emma, he keeps asking weird questions about our family, about Dad's business, about whether you have any other income streams. It's like he's suddenly suspicious of everyone. Paranoia was setting in faster than I'd anticipated. The package had done its job. Marcus now knew that someone was watching him, investigating him, building a case against him, but he couldn't know who or how much they'd discovered. I'm sure it's nothing, I said, watching through the feed as Marcus threw his phone onto the couch in frustration. Wedding planning can make anyone paranoid. Remember how crazy I got before everything changed? The reminder of my failed engagement was calculated, designed to make Victoria feel guilty enough to confide in me rather than question my motives for calling. You're probably right, Victoria sighed. I love him so much, Emma. I couldn't bear it if something was wrong. Love, she still believed it was love driving Marcus's behavior, not the careful calculation that had led him to target our family in the first place. But that innocence would work in my favor. The more blindly she trusted him, the more devastating the revelation would be when it came. Why don't I come over tonight? I offered. We could look at wedding dress catalogs, maybe order some food. It might help both of you relax. The suggestion was met with obvious relief. Would you? That would be amazing. Marcus has a business dinner anyway, so it would be perfect girl time. Perfect indeed. Marcus's business dinner was actually a meeting with Vincent Torres at a discreet restaurant downtown, a meeting I knew about because I'd been monitoring his communications for weeks. While he was busy trying to figure out who was investigating him, I'd be in the penthouse with Victoria, planting the seeds for Phase 2. After hanging up, I opened my laptop to review the afternoon's agenda. David had filed the first set of legal documents at 9 a.m., officially challenging the validity of Nana's will on grounds of undue influence and mental incompetence. The process server would deliver the papers to Victoria at precisely 4 p.m., giving her just enough time to panic before I arrived for our sister bonding session. My phone buzzed with a text from my investigator. Subject met with T at Meridian Restaurant. Full recording obtained. You were right about the timeline. I smiled, pulling up the recording on my secure server. Marcus's voice was clear despite the restaurant's ambient noise. Someone knows, he was saying, his usual confidence replaced by genuine fear. The photos, the bank records, this is professional-level surveillance. We need to accelerate the timeline. Vincent's response was equally concerning. How much has she accessed already? The grandmother's accounts? Most of it, but there's more coming. Her parents' assets, plus the sister's business is worth way more than we originally thought. We just need to keep the fiancé happy until we can get power of attorney set up. Power of attorney. The final piece of Marcus's plan was to convince Victoria to give him legal control over her finances, ostensibly for wedding planning and their future together. Once he had that, he could drain everything and disappear, leaving Victoria with nothing but debt and broken dreams. But Marcus had made a crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed my business assets were community property that Victoria might eventually inherit. He had no idea that everything I'd built was protected by layers of corporate structures and offshore trusts that even the most sophisticated investigators would struggle to penetrate. The process server arrived at the penthouse right on schedule. Through my surveillance feed, I watched Victoria's face crumble as she read the legal documents challenging the will. She called me immediately, tears evident in her voice. Emma, something horrible is happening. There's a lawyer saying Nana's will was invalid, that she wasn't mentally competent when she changed it. They're trying to take everything away. I feigned shock and concern. That's impossible. Who would do such a thing? I don't know, Victoria sobbed. The papers don't say who filed the challenge, just that new evidence has come to light about night external manipulation and coercion. What if someone was taking advantage of Nana? What if I lose everything? The irony was exquisite. Victoria was terrified that someone had manipulated our grandmother, never suspecting that she'd been the one doing the manipulating all along. The legal challenge was designed to force her to defend her inheritance, which would require proving that she hadn't influenced Nana's decision. An impossible task, given the evidence I'd compiled. Don't worry, I said soothingly. We'll figure this out together. I'm on my way over right now. The penthouse felt different when I arrived, the atmosphere heavy with anxiety and uncertainty. Victoria had been crying, her perfect makeup smeared, and her designer dress wrinkled from pacing. She looked vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. "I called Marcus," she said, leading me to the living room where legal documents were scattered across the antique coffee table Nana had loved. "But he's not answering his phone. His business dinner must be really important." I sat beside her on the silk sofa, the same one where Nana used to tell us stories about building her fortune from nothing. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Here was Victoria, surrounded by luxury she'd stolen, terrified of losing what she'd never deserved in the first place. "Let me look at these papers," I said, picking up the legal documents I'd helped craft. "Maybe I can make sense of what's happening." As I pretended to read, Victoria poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My heart rate spiked, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course. Did you file this challenge?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of sibling rivalry and recent betrayal. I met her eyes directly, allowing a flicker of hurt to cross my face. "How could you even ask me that? Victoria, you're my sister." "Yes, I was surprised by Nana's decision, but I would never try to steal your inheritance through legal technicalities." The lie came easily, especially wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. I had been surprised by Nana's decision, surprised by how thoroughly Victoria had manipulated a vulnerable old woman. Victoria's shoulders sagged with relief. "I'm sorry, I'm just so scared. What if whoever filed this has evidence? What if they can prove something that isn't true?" "What could they prove?" I asked gently, setting the trap. "You didn't do anything wrong, did you?" The pause before her answer told me everything I needed to know. "Of course not. I spent a lot of time with Nana in her final weeks. Maybe someone misunderstood my intentions." Misunderstood. Such a delicate way to describe systematic manipulation and emotional abuse of an elderly woman. But Victoria's guilt was showing, and that would make the next phases much easier. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Emergency at work. Won't make it home tonight. Don't wait up." I showed Victoria the message, watching her face fall further. "He's under a lot of pressure at work," she said, but doubt was creeping into her voice. "The timing is it's really bad." "Men handle stress differently," I said, though I knew exactly where Marcus was. Back at the Meridian restaurant, meeting with Vincent Torres again to plan their exit strategy. "Why don't we focus on something positive? Show me the wedding dress options you've been considering." For the next hour, I played the supportive sister role perfectly, exclaiming over fabric swatches and venue decorations while mentally cataloging every detail that would soon become irrelevant. Victoria began to relax, the wine and wedding planning providing a temporary escape from her legal troubles. "I've been thinking about asking Marcus to handle some of the financial planning," she said, showing me a reception venue that cost more per hour than most people earned in a month. "He's so good with money, and I get overwhelmed by all the details." There it was, the opening Marcus had been working toward, power of attorney disguised as wedding planning assistance. "That's sweet of him to offer," I said carefully, "though you might want to wait until after this legal challenge is resolved. Banks can be funny about asset transfers when there's ongoing litigation." Victoria's face fell. "I hadn't thought of that. Everything is so complicated now." "It'll work out," I assured her, patting her hand. Truth has a way of coming to light, even when people try to hide it. My phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from my security system. Someone was trying to access my apartment building, someone who'd been sitting in a car outside for the past hour. The surveillance footage showed a man I didn't recognize, but the license plate traced back to a rental car paid for with one of Marcus's credit cards. Marcus was having me investigated, probably trying to figure out if I was the source of his problems. The paranoia was accelerating his timeline, just as I'd hoped. Desperate people make mistakes, and Marcus was about to make several. "I should probably head home," I said, gathering my purse. "Early morning tomorrow." Victoria walked me to the door, her earlier panic replaced by wine-induced melancholy. "Emma, I know things have been weird between us but I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you." The statement hung between us, begging for forgiveness she hadn't earned and understanding she didn't deserve. But I smiled and hugged her anyway, playing my role to perfection. "I know, Vic, sometimes things just happen the way they're supposed to." As I rode the elevator down, I reviewed the evening's progress. Victoria was scared and increasingly isolated. Marcus's absence during her crisis had planted seeds of doubt that would only grow stronger. The legal challenge had her questioning everything she thought she knew about her inheritance, and Marcus was spiraling into paranoia, making increasingly desperate moves that would only provide more evidence for my case. The man in the rental car followed me home, maintaining what he probably thought was a professional distance. I made it easy for him, stopping at a grocery store and taking my time selecting items I didn't need, giving him plenty of opportunity to observe my supposedly modest lifestyle. Back in my apartment, I settled at my computer to review the day's intelligence. Marcus and Vincent had met twice, their conversations growing more frantic with each session. They were planning to accelerate their timeline, possibly pushing Victoria for financial control within the week instead of waiting until after the wedding. That urgency would work perfectly for Phase 3 of my plan. The more desperate Marcus became, the more mistakes he'd make, and each mistake would provide more evidence of his true intentions, evidence that would shatter Victoria's fantasy world once and for all. My secure phone rang, David calling from his office where he was working late on our project. "The legal challenge is already causing ripples," he reported. "Victoria's lawyers are scrambling to build a defense, but they're starting from a position of weakness. The evidence of undue influence is overwhelming." "What about Marcus? His financials are interesting. Large cash deposits over the past 6 months, all from accounts traced back to your grandmother's estate. It looks like he's been skimming money and hiding it in offshore accounts." I smiled, pulling up the surveillance feed from the penthouse. Victoria was alone in the master bedroom, staring at her phone and probably wondering why her fiancé wasn't there to comfort her during the biggest crisis of her life. How long before she figures out what he's really been doing? At this rate? David paused, reviewing his own files. The beauty is that she doesn't have to figure it out. The evidence will do that for her. As I prepared for bed, I took one last look at the surveillance feeds. Victoria was finally asleep, but Marcus still hadn't come home. His GPS tracker showed him at a hotel downtown, probably planning his next move with Vincent. They thought they were being careful, strategic, professional. They had no idea that every conversation was being recorded, every financial transaction monitored, every move documented by a network of investigators and legal professionals I'd been building for months. Tomorrow would bring new developments, more pressure on Victoria, more desperation from Marcus, and more evidence to support the case I was methodically building against them. The perfect wedding they were planning would become the perfect venue for revealing the truth. After all, justice had its own timeline, and mine was right on schedule. The call came at 3:47 a.m., Victoria's voice shattered by tears and panic. "Emma, please, I need you. Something's happened. The police were here." I sat up in bed, though I'd been awake for hours monitoring the situation through my various feeds. "Police? What's going on?" "It's about Nana's accounts. They're saying someone has been transferring money illegally. Large amounts. They asked about Marcus, about when he started having access." Her voice broke into sobs. Through my surveillance system, I could see the penthouse in chaos, papers scattered everywhere, drawers pulled open, evidence of a thorough search. The Financial Crimes Unit had executed their warrant with precision, seizing documents and electronic devices that would paint a very clear picture of Marcus's activities. "Where is Marcus now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I don't know. He left yesterday morning and never came back. His phone goes straight to voicemail." "Emma, I'm so scared. What if he's involved in something terrible?" What if? As though the possibility hadn't been staring her in the face for months. But Victoria had been so blinded by Marcus's charm and her own greed that she'd ignored every red flag, every warning sign, every moment of doubt. "I'm coming over," I said, already reaching for clothes I'd laid out in preparation for this moment. "Don't say anything else to anyone until I get there." The drive to the penthouse gave me time to review the night's choreographed events. The financial crimes investigation had been triggered by an anonymous tip, complete with bank records, transaction histories, and recorded conversations between Marcus and Vincent Torres. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a clear picture of systematic inheritance fraud spanning multiple states and victims. But the real masterstroke had been the timing. Marcus's disappearance wasn't random. My investigator had spotted him and Vincent at the airport at midnight, apparently planning to flee the country. A single phone call to airport security about suspicious individuals with large amounts of cash had delayed their departure just long enough for the authorities to connect them to the morning's investigation. Victoria was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, still in yesterday's clothes, her face pale and streaked with mascara. She looked like a ghost of the confident woman who'd flaunted her stolen inheritance just days ago. "They took everything," she whispered as we rode the elevator up. "Computers, phones, documents. They said it was evidence in a federal investigation." The penthouse felt violated, which was ironic considering how Victoria had violated our grandmother's trust to obtain it. Furniture was askew, artwork had been removed from walls, and the safe in Nana's study stood open and empty. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, guiding Victoria to the living room couch. Through broken sentences and tears, she recounted the morning's events. Federal agents arriving at dawn with a search warrant, questions about Marcus's access to her grandmother's accounts, evidence of transfers totaling nearly $2 million to accounts Victoria had never seen before. "They showed me bank statements," she said, her voice hollow. "Money moving from Nana's accounts to ones I didn't know existed, all with Marcus's signature on the authorization forms." I picked up one of the documents the agents had left behind, a courtesy copy of the financial crimes report. The scope was staggering. Marcus hadn't just been skimming from Nana's estate, he'd been systematically draining accounts for months, using his position as Victoria's fiancé to gain access to financial information, and then exploiting security weaknesses to transfer funds. "Victoria," I said gently, "when did you give Marcus access to Nana's accounts?" Her silence was answer enough. She'd trusted him completely, probably sharing passwords and account information without a second thought. The same impulsiveness that had led her to steal my fiancé had made her the perfect mark for his con. "He said it would make wedding planning easier," she finally admitted. "He offered to handle the financial arrangements, to make sure everything was perfect. I thought he was being romantic." Romantic? Marcus had convinced her that theft was romance, that betrayal was love, that destroying our family's legacy was a gesture of devotion. The manipulation was masterful in its simplicity. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from David. "Torres arrested at JFK. Singing like a canary. Full confession implicates 3 other family schemes, including yours." Vincent Torres had been caught trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with falsified documents and enough cash to fund a comfortable retirement. Faced with federal charges and evidence of multiple inheritance frauds, he'd immediately rolled over on Marcus and provided details about their entire operation. "There's something else," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The agents asked about you. About whether Marcus had shown any interest in your business, your finances." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, when Victoria would finally understand that Marcus's interest in our family hadn't stopped with her inheritance, that she'd been groomed as step 1 in a larger plan to systematically exploit everyone she cared about. "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that he'd been asking questions lately, seeming more interested in family finances than usual." "Emma," she turned to me with dawning horror. "He was going to target you next, wasn't he?" I let the realization settle over her, watching as the full scope of Marcus's betrayal became clear. She'd thought she was special, chosen, loved. Instead, she'd been a mark in an elaborate con game, valuable only for her access to family resources. "We need to call Mom and Dad," I said, pulling out my phone. "They need to know what's happening before the story breaks in the media." The conversation with our parents was devastating. Dad's business accounts, Mom's retirement savings, even the college funds they'd been building for potential grandchildren. Marcus had been researching all of it, building profiles and looking for vulnerabilities. Victoria's relationship with him had given him access to intimate family financial information that he'd planned to exploit systematically. "How could we have been so blind?" Mom asked through tears during our video call. "He seemed so charming, so devoted to Victoria." "Predators are skilled at manipulation," I said, though I was looking directly at Victoria as I spoke. "They tell people what they want to hear, make them feel special and chosen. They exploit trust and love as weapons." Victoria flinched at my words, understanding that they applied to more than just Marcus's behavior. She'd used similar tactics on Nana, exploiting an elderly woman's love and vulnerability to manipulate her into changing her will. After the call ended, Victoria sat in stunned silence, staring at the empty spaces where Nana's most valuable pieces had been displayed. The federal investigation had seized everything connected to the fraudulent transfers, which meant most of the inheritance was now frozen as evidence. "I've lost everything, haven't I?" she asked finally. "Not everything," I said, sitting beside her. "You still have family. You still have people who love you despite the mistakes you've made." She looked at me with something approaching gratitude, though I wasn't sure she understood the full meaning of my words yet. The mistakes she'd made extended far beyond trusting Marcus. They included betraying me, manipulating our grandmother, and choosing greed over family loyalty. My secure phone chimed with another update. Marcus had been arrested at a private airfield in Connecticut, apparently trying to charter a jet to a non-extradition country. The cash found in his possession matched serial numbers from Nana's bank withdrawals, providing definitive proof of his theft. They found him, I told Victoria, showing her the news alert on my phone. Marcus has been arrested. Her reaction was complex, relief mixed with grief, anger tempered by lingering love. She'd built her entire identity around being Marcus's chosen one, and now she had to face the reality that she'd never been anything more than a convenient tool in his larger scheme. The wedding, she said suddenly, as if just remembering. We were supposed to get married in 3 months. I sent out invitations, booked vendors, spent. She trailed off, realizing that most of the wedding expenses had been paid with stolen money. The venue will understand, I said gently, given the circumstances. Over the next few hours, the full scope of the investigation began to emerge. News vans gathered outside the penthouse building. Financial reporters started calling Victoria's phone. The story had everything the media loved: wealth, betrayal, family drama, and a con man who'd targeted multiple families across several states. Victoria's phone rang constantly until she finally turned it off, overwhelmed by the attention and the questions she couldn't answer. Her lawyers were struggling to separate her from Marcus's crimes, arguing that she'd been a victim rather than an accomplice. But the legal challenge to Nana's will remained active, and the evidence of undue influence was stronger than ever. Victoria's manipulation of our grandmother looked even worse in the context of Marcus's broader fraud scheme. It painted a picture of a family being systematically exploited by 2 different predators working in concert. "Emma," Victoria said as afternoon shadows lengthened across the empty penthouse, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I braced myself, wondering if she'd finally connected the dots between my sudden helpfulness and the convenient timing of Marcus's downfall. "Do you think I'm going to prison?" The question revealed how completely she still misunderstood her situation. She was focused on legal consequences, not moral ones. She was worried about punishment, not redemption. "That depends," I said carefully, "on how much you cooperate with the investigation and how honest you are about everything that happened." What I didn't say was that Victoria's cooperation would primarily serve to document her own role in manipulating Nana. Every detail she provided about how she'd gained the old woman's trust would strengthen the case for invalidating the will. My phone buzzed with a message from my investigator. "Local news wants to interview you as the other sister. How do you want to handle media?" I typed back, "Decline all interviews. Refer them to family lawyers." The last thing I needed was media attention that might reveal my true financial situation or raise questions about how thoroughly I'd investigated Marcus's background. Better to remain in the shadows, playing the supportive sister role while my enemies destroyed themselves with their own evidence. Victoria was staring out the window at the news vans below, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. How did this happen so fast? Yesterday everything was perfect, and now you're seeing the truth, I finished for her. The question is what you're going to do with it. She turned to me with desperate eyes. "Help me, Emma. Please. I know I don't deserve it, after everything that's happened, but you're the only family I have left who might still trust me." Trust. The word hung between us, loaded with irony. She was asking for trust from the sister she'd betrayed, seeking help from the person whose inheritance she'd stolen, begging for support from someone whose fiancé she'd seduced. But her desperation was exactly what I needed for the final phases of my plan. A broken, grateful Victoria would be much more useful than a confident, entitled one. "Of course I'll help you," I said, taking her hand. "But you have to promise me something in return. Anything. Complete honesty. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more trying to control the narrative. Whatever happens from here, we face it together as sisters." Victoria nodded eagerly, though I wondered if she truly understood what complete honesty would cost her. The evidence I'd compiled over the past months painted a very clear picture of her role in manipulating Nana, and complete honesty would require admitting to actions that would destroy any remaining sympathy for her situation. As evening fell and the news crews finally dispersed, I helped Victoria pack a bag. The penthouse would likely be seized as part of the federal investigation. Since it had been purchased with fraudulently obtained funds, she would need somewhere to stay while the legal proceedings unfolded. You can stay with me, I offered, though the suggestion made my stomach turn. It's not much, but it's private and safe. The irony was perfect. Victoria, who had stolen my inheritance and mocked my modest lifestyle, would now be dependent on my charity. The woman who had convinced our grandmother that I was too successful and didn't need help would now be homeless without my support. Thank you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what I would do without you. As we drove away from the penthouse for what would likely be the last time, Victoria stared back at the building that had represented everything she thought she'd gained. Now it was just another piece of evidence in a federal case, its luxury tainted by the knowledge of how it had really been acquired. Emma, she said quietly as we pulled into traffic, do you think Nana would have forgiven me if she knew what really happened? The question revealed the first crack in Victoria's denial, the beginning of genuine remorse for what she'd done to our grandmother. But forgiveness would require more than regret. It would require full acknowledgement of her actions and their consequences. I think Nana always hoped we'd take care of each other, I said, which was true enough to ease my conscience while avoiding the larger question of whether the dead could forgive the living. Back at my apartment, I showed Victoria to the guest room I'd prepared months ago in anticipation of this moment. She looked around at the modest space with something approaching gratitude, a stark contrast to her previous disdain for my simple lifestyle. As she settled in for what would be the first of many difficult nights ahead, I reviewed the day's progress in my private office. Marcus was in federal custody, Vincent Torres was cooperating with investigators, and the Financial Crimes Unit had enough evidence to ensure both men would spend years in prison. But the real victory wasn't in their destruction, it was in Victoria's transformation from confident predator to broken victim. The sister who had stolen my inheritance was now dependent on my charity. The woman who had seduced my fiancé was now sleeping in my guest room, grateful for my support. Phase 3 was complete. Now came the delicate work of rebuilding Victoria's life in a way that served justice while maintaining my facade of sisterly support. After all, the best revenge wasn't just about tearing down what your enemies had built. It was about building something better in its place, something that served the truth rather than their lies. Victoria had been living in my guest room for 2 weeks when she finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. Emma, how are you affording all this? She gestured around my apartment, the same space she'd once pitied me for, with new eyes. 2 weeks of depending on my generosity had given her time to notice details she'd previously ignored. The original artwork on the walls wasn't from department stores. The furniture was custom-made, not assembled from boxes. The technology humming quietly in my home office was enterprise level, not consumer grade. I've been doing well with consulting, I said, maintaining the careful fiction I'd built over the years. Some of my clients pay quite generously. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did consult for major corporations, helping them restructure and optimize their operations. What Victoria didn't know was that I owned the consulting firm, along with 6 others that specialized in everything from cybersecurity to international finance. But the lawyer's fees, Victoria pressed, her voice small. You've been paying for everything. My legal defense, the forensic accountants, even my therapy sessions, that has to be costing you tens of thousands. Try hundreds of thousands, I thought, but kept my expression neutral. You're my sister. Family takes care of family. The words hung between us, heavy with irony. Victoria's face crumpled, and I could see her wrestling with guilt that had been building for days. The generous sister she'd betrayed was now sacrificing financially to save her from the consequences of her own choices, or so she believed. My phone rang, interrupting the moment. David's name flashed on the screen, and I excused myself to take the call in my office. The prosecution wants to meet, he reported without preamble. They're offering Victoria immunity in exchange for full cooperation against Marcus and Torres. I'd been expecting this development. Victoria's cooperation would be valuable. She had intimate knowledge of Marcus's methods and access to conversations the prosecutors could only dream of obtaining. But immunity came with strings attached. What kind of cooperation? Everything. Her relationship with Marcus, how he gained access to your grandmother's accounts, what she knows about his previous relationships. They want her to testify at trial. I could hear Victoria moving around in the kitchen, probably making the herbal tea that had become her new coping mechanism since discovering Marcus's betrayal. She was fragile now, broken in ways that made her malleable to suggestion. There's something else, David continued. The will challenge is gaining momentum. The probate judge wants to hear testimony about your grandmother's mental state in her final weeks. Victoria's going to have to explain her role in changing the will. This was the moment I'd been orchestrating for months, when Victoria would have to choose between protecting herself and telling the truth about how she'd manipulated our grandmother. The immunity deal would require complete honesty, which meant admitting to behavior that would destroy any remaining sympathy for her position. When do they want to meet? Tomorrow morning. And Emma? David's voice carried a note of concern. Are you sure you want to put her through this? She's already broken. This testimony could destroy what's left of her sense of self. I looked through my office window at Victoria sitting at my kitchen table, staring into her teacup with hollow eyes. 2 weeks ago, she'd been radiant with stolen happiness, planning her dream wedding with money that wasn't hers. Now she was a ghost of that person, sustained only by my carefully calculated kindness. She destroyed herself, I said quietly. I'm just making sure there are consequences. After ending the call, I returned to the kitchen where Victoria was still lost in thought. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the confident woman who'd flaunted her inheritance and mocked my supposed failures. In her place sat someone who jumped at unexpected sounds and apologized for taking up space in my home. The prosecutors want to meet with you tomorrow, I said, sitting across from her at the table. They're offering immunity in exchange for your testimony against Marcus. Victoria's hands tightened around her teacup. Immunity from what? I didn't know what he was doing. You knew enough, I said gently, delivering the truth with surgical precision. You gave him access to Nana's accounts. You shared financial information about our family. You helped him understand our vulnerabilities, even if you didn't realize what he planned to do with that information. The words hit their target perfectly. Victoria's face went white as she processed the implications. In her grief over Marcus's betrayal, she hadn't fully considered her own legal exposure. She'd been so focused on being his victim that she'd ignored her role as his enabler. They think I was part of it, she whispered. Were you? The question surprised her. She looked up at me with wounded eyes, seeking the reassurance I'd been providing for 2 weeks. But this time, I let the silence stretch between us, forcing her to confront the answer she'd been avoiding. I didn't know about the stealing, she said finally. But Emma, I did manipulate Nana into changing the will. I convinced her that you didn't need the inheritance, that you were already successful enough. I made her feel guilty about leaving me out. There it was, the first genuine admission of guilt I'd heard from Victoria since this entire ordeal began. The confession she'd been avoiding, even in her own mind, the truth that made everything else possible. Why? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because I was jealous, Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. You were always the smart one, the successful one, the one everyone was proud of. I wanted something that was mine, something I'd earned instead of being given because people felt sorry for me. The irony was devastating. Victoria had manipulated our grandmother to steal an inheritance she felt she deserved, only to hand it over to a con man who'd never felt anything for her beyond calculated greed. Her jealousy of my success had blinded her to the value of what she already had: family, love, security. And Marcus? I pressed. I knew he was your fiancé when I started flirting with him, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I told myself it was just harmless fun, but I knew where it was leading. I wanted to prove that I could take something from you for once, that I could be the one someone chose. The confession was more complete than I dared hope for. Victoria wasn't just admitting to financial manipulation, she was acknowledging the deliberate betrayal that had started this entire chain of events. She'd stolen my fiancé not from passion or love, but from spite and sibling rivalry. Tomorrow's meeting is going to be difficult, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand, but it's also your chance to start making things right, to tell the truth about everything that happened. Victoria nodded, though her eyes held a fear that went beyond legal consequences. She was beginning to understand that the truth would require dismantling the narrative she'd built around her own actions. The story where she was a victim of love and circumstance would have to be replaced with one where she was an active participant in deception and betrayal. That evening, I helped Victoria prepare for her meeting with the prosecutors. We went through her relationship with Marcus chronologically, identifying key moments when she'd provided him with information that had facilitated his fraud. Each revelation was another small devastation for her, another crack in the foundation of lies she'd built her new life upon. He asked so many questions about our family, she said, reviewing notes we'd made together. About Dad's business, about your consulting work, about Nana's investments. I thought he was just trying to understand our background, to fit in. He was building a target profile, I explained, drawing on knowledge I'd gained from my own investigation into Marcus's methods. Every detail you shared helped him understand how to exploit our family's resources. The pattern was clear once laid out objectively. Marcus had systematically gathered intelligence about our family's finances, using Victoria's trust and desire to share her happiness as weapons against us all. Her enthusiasm about their relationship had made her the perfect unwitting spy. My secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from my investigator, Taurus, providing additional details about previous schemes. Pattern matches your sister's experience exactly. I excused myself to review the new intelligence. Vincent Torres, facing decades in federal prison, had become remarkably forthcoming about his partnership with Marcus. Their operation had targeted at least 7 families over 5 years, always following the same pattern: identify a vulnerable family member with access to wealth, seduce them with romance and attention, then systematically drain available resources before disappearing. Victoria had been textbook perfect for their scheme. Wealthy grandmother, successful sister, naive personality that craved validation. Marcus had probably identified her as a target long before their first chance meeting at that charity gala. The next morning, I accompanied Victoria to the federal building downtown for her meeting with the prosecution team. She was nervous, dressed in a conservative suit I'd helped her select, trying to project the image of a cooperative witness rather than a co-conspirator. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, was younger than I'd expected but clearly competent. She walked Victoria through the immunity agreement, explaining the requirements for complete honesty and cooperation. "Miss Morrison," Martinez said, using Victoria's maiden name since her engagement was obviously terminated, "we need you to understand that this immunity only applies if you provide truthful and complete testimony. Any omissions or lies will void the agreement and leave you open to prosecution." Victoria nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she signed the documents. She was crossing a point of no return, committing to revealing everything about her relationship with Marcus and her role in our grandmother's financial exploitation. The questioning that followed was thorough and methodical. Victoria described her first meeting with Marcus, their courtship, his gradual request for financial information. She detailed how she'd convinced our grandmother to change the will, the arguments she'd used, the emotional manipulation she'd employed. "Did Mr. Blackwell specifically instruct you to influence your grandmother's estate planning?" Martinez asked. Victoria hesitated, clearly wrestling with the answer. "Not directly, but he would make comments about how unfair it was that Emma got all the attention and opportunities in our family. He suggested that I deserved more recognition, more security for our future together." "And you interpreted this as encouragement to change the will?" "I wanted to please him," Victoria admitted. "I wanted to prove that I could provide for our relationship the way Emma had always provided for herself." The confession painted a picture of systematic manipulation on multiple levels. Marcus had manipulated Victoria, who had then manipulated our grandmother, creating a chain of deception that had ultimately benefited only Marcus's criminal enterprise. As the session concluded, Martinez outlined Victoria's ongoing responsibilities. She would need to remain available for testimony, continue cooperating with the investigation, and provide access to any additional evidence that might surface. "There's one more thing," Martinez said as we prepared to leave. "The will contest is proceeding separately from the criminal case. Your testimony here may be used in those proceedings as well." Victoria's face went pale. She'd been so focused on avoiding criminal charges that she'd forgotten about the civil litigation challenging her inheritance. Her cooperating with the prosecution would provide evidence for invalidating the will she'd manipulated our grandmother into creating. In the car afterward, Victoria was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what she'd just committed to do. "I'm going to lose everything, aren't I?" she asked finally. "You're going to face the consequences of your choices," I corrected gently. "But consequences aren't the same thing as punishment. Sometimes they're the beginning of redemption." That afternoon, my lawyer called with an update on the will contest proceedings. Victoria's testimony to the prosecution had been shared with the probate court, where it would form the foundation for proving undue influence. The inheritance she'd stolen through manipulation would be returned to its rightful distribution, split equally between Victoria and me as Nana had originally intended. But there was more. The forensic accounting had revealed that Marcus had stolen nearly $3 million from the estate, money that would need to be recovered and returned. Victoria's immunity deal required her to assist in asset recovery, which meant helping to trace every penny Marcus had stolen from our family. There's something else, my lawyer continued. The court is considering requiring Victoria to undergo psychological evaluation and counseling as a condition of receiving her inheritance. They want to ensure she's learned from this experience. I smiled, thinking of Victoria sitting in my living room, dependent on my charity, and grateful for my support. The court-ordered counseling would be redundant. I'd already begun her rehabilitation, guiding her toward the remorse and self-awareness that would make her a better person. When I returned home that evening, I found Victoria in the kitchen attempting to cook dinner, a simple gesture of gratitude that she'd never bothered with during her months of luxury. The woman who'd once hired personal chefs with stolen money was now struggling to make pasta in my modest kitchen. "How did it go with your lawyer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Well," I said, helping her with the sauce she was clearly failing to manage. "The will contest is proceeding. You'll probably get to keep half of the original inheritance, minus what Marcus stole." Victoria's relief was visible, though tempered by the knowledge that she'd still lost millions to Marcus's fraud. She'd gone from inheriting everything to getting half of what remained, a significant downgrade from her previous position, but still more than she deserved given her role in the manipulation. "And the other half," she asked, "goes to me," I said simply, "the way it was originally supposed to be distributed." Victoria nodded, accepting the justice of this arrangement. After weeks of my generosity and support, she'd come to see my inheritance as earned rather than stolen. The contrast between my behavior and Marcus's had reframed her understanding of who deserved what. "Emma," she said as we sat down to eat the simple meal she'd prepared, "I want you to know that when this is all over, when I get my life back together, I'm going to pay you back for everything you've done for me." I smiled, thinking of the millions I'd already recovered through various legal mechanisms, the business empire I'd built while she was playing house with stolen money, the careful orchestration that had brought us to this moment. "Family doesn't keep score," I said, which was true enough. I wasn't keeping score because I'd already won the game. As Victoria cleared the dishes with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to appreciate simple tasks, I reviewed the day's progress. She'd confessed to the prosecutors, committed to full cooperation, and accepted the inevitability of losing most of her stolen inheritance. More importantly, she'd begun to genuinely understand the magnitude of her betrayal and the kindness I'd shown in response. The broken woman washing dishes in my kitchen bore little resemblance to the confident predator who'd stolen my fiancé an inheritance 6 months ago. Victoria had been systematically dismantled and was now being rebuilt according to my specifications, grateful, remorseful, and completely dependent on my continued goodwill. Phase 4 was complete. Now came the delicate work of ensuring that Victoria's redemption served justice while maintaining the fiction that I was simply a forgiving sister who'd risen above betrayal through pure goodness. After all, the best revenge wasn't just about destroying your enemies, it was about rebuilding them as better people who would spend the rest of their lives grateful for your mercy. 3 months into Victoria's stay at my apartment, she made a discovery that changed everything. I was in my home office conducting a video conference with clients in Singapore when I heard the sharp intake of breath from the hallway. Through my security cameras, I watched Victoria standing frozen outside my partially open door, staring at my monitors displaying real-time data from 6 different companies. She'd seen the financial dashboards, the multiple video feeds of corporate boardrooms, the encrypted communications scrolling across military-grade displays. Most damning of all, she'd glimpsed the organizational chart on my main screen, one that showed my name at the top of a complex web of holdings and subsidiaries. "Emma," she called softly after I'd ended my call, "we need to talk." I found her in the living room sitting on the edge of the couch with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The discovery had shaken her, but there was something else in her expression. A growing understanding that was both frightening and inevitable. "You're not just a consultant, are you?" she asked without preamble. The moment I'd been preparing for since the day she moved in had finally arrived. Victoria had stumbled onto the truth about my business empire, and now I had to decide how much to reveal. "I own several companies," I said carefully, settling into the chair across from her. "The consulting work is just one aspect of what I do." "Several companies." Victoria's voice was flat, processing the implications. "Emma, I saw the monitors. Those weren't client presentations, you were running board meetings. You were making decisions worth millions of dollars." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window as her mind raced through the ramifications. All this time, while I was worried about paying you back, while I was grateful for your charity, you're actually wealthy. Really wealthy. Yes. The simple admission hung between us, stripping away months of carefully maintained fiction. Victoria turned from the window, her face cycling through confusion, realization, and something approaching horror. When you said Marcus was targeting our family's resources, she said slowly, you meant he was targeting you specifically, your money, not Nana's inheritance. Among other things, yes. Victoria sank back onto the couch, the full scope of her manipulation finally becoming clear. He knew, didn't he? About your businesses, your wealth. That's why he was so interested in family finances. He wasn't just planning to steal from Nana, he was planning to get to you through me. I nodded, watching her piece together the truth she'd been too blinded by jealousy to see months ago. Marcus hadn't chosen Victoria because he loved her, or even primarily because of her access to our grandmother's money. He'd targeted her because she was my sister, because a relationship with her would eventually provide access to resources that dwarfed anything Nana had accumulated. But you knew, Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. You knew what he was doing from the beginning. I suspected, I corrected. I had him investigated after your engagement announcement. The evidence confirmed my concerns. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Her analytical mind, the one she'd always possessed but rarely used, working through the timeline of events. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder. The package he found in his apartment, the surveillance, the perfectly timed federal investigation. She looked at me with new eyes. You orchestrated all of this, didn't you? The question carried no anger, just a kind of awed recognition. Victoria was finally seeing me clearly, not as the struggling sister she'd pitied, or the generous savior she'd been grateful to, but as someone who'd been playing a far more sophisticated game than she'd ever imagined. I protected our family, I said simply. You destroyed him, Victoria corrected. You built a case against Marcus and Vincent that was so thorough, so overwhelming, that they never had a chance. You turned me into a prosecution witness against the man I thought I loved, and I didn't even realize I was following your script. She wasn't wrong. From the moment I'd discovered their affair, I'd been carefully guiding events toward this outcome. Victoria's cooperation with the prosecution hadn't been her choice. It had been the inevitable result of circumstances I'd created. And the will contest, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. You're going to win that too, aren't you? My testimony about manipulating Nana just handed you all the evidence you needed. I was always going to win the will contest, I said, allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. You committed elder abuse, Victoria. You manipulated a vulnerable old woman into changing her will through emotional coercion. The evidence for that existed long before Marcus entered the picture. Victoria flinched at the blunt assessment, but she didn't argue. The months of therapy and self-reflection had forced her to confront the reality of what she'd done to our grandmother. So what happens now, she asked, now that I know who you really are? It was a fair question. Victoria had discovered that everything she thought she understood about our relationship was built on false assumptions. The power dynamic between us wasn't what she'd believed. I wasn't the generous sister sacrificing to help her. I was the puppet master who'd been controlling her movements from the beginning. Now we decide what kind of relationship we want to have going forward, I said, one based on truth instead of manipulation. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Truth? Emma, you've been lying to me for months. You let me feel guilty about taking your charity when you're probably worth more than the entire inheritance I stole. You guided me through a legal process that served your interests while making me think it was for my own good. Everything I did was for your own good, I replied. Marcus would have destroyed you financially and emotionally, then disappeared with everything you thought you'd gained. The federal investigation saved you from worse consequences down the line, by turning me into a weapon against him, by giving you a chance to do the right thing. Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her wrestling with conflicting emotions, anger at being manipulated, warred with gratitude for being saved, resentment over my deception fought with admiration for my strategic thinking. You could have just told me, she said finally, about Marcus, about what he was planning. We could have worked together to stop him. Would you have believed me? I asked. 3 months ago, if I'd told you that your perfect fiancé was a con artist targeting our family, what would your reaction have been? Victoria's silence was answer enough. 3 months ago, she'd been so invested in her fairy tale romance that she would have dismissed any evidence against Marcus as jealousy or spite. She would have chosen to believe his denials over my warnings. "You made me complicit in my own rescue," she said, understanding finally dawning. "By making me discover the truth myself, by letting me choose to cooperate with the prosecution, you ensured I couldn't claim I was just following your orders." "I ensured you learned from the experience," I corrected. "Lessons you're given are easily forgotten. Lessons you discover yourself tend to stick." My secure phone buzzed with an urgent message from David. Marcus attempting to recant his confession. Claims he was manipulated by unknown third party. Legal team requesting immediate consultation. I glanced at Victoria, who was watching my reaction carefully. Marcus's desperation was escalating, and his lawyers had apparently found inconsistencies in the evidence chain that they were trying to exploit. "I need to handle something," I said, standing. "We can continue this conversation later." "No," Victoria's voice stopped me at the office door. "I want to know what's happening. If Marcus is trying to escape justice, I want to help stop him." I studied her face, seeing a determination that hadn't been there during her months of broken gratitude. The discovery of my true position had changed our dynamic, but it had also awakened something in Victoria that I hadn't seen since we were children, a sense of purpose that went beyond her own immediate interests. "He's trying to claim his confession was coerced," I said, deciding to trust her with the truth. "His lawyers think they've found procedural violations that might invalidate the evidence." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Because of my testimony? Because they can prove I was coached?" "Possibly. If they can demonstrate that you were acting under my direction rather than making independent choices, it could undermine the prosecution's case." It was a genuine concern. Marcus's lawyers had clearly done their homework, identifying the unusual precision of the evidence against their client. If they could prove that Victoria had been following a script I'd written, they might be able to argue that the entire case was the product of entrapment rather than legitimate investigation. "Then we fix it," Victoria said simply. "I'll testify again, clarify that my decisions were my own. I'll make it clear that you didn't coach me." I looked at her with new respect. The broken woman who'd been grateful for my charity was gone, replaced by someone who understood the stakes and was willing to fight for justice regardless of personal cost. "That might not be enough," I said. "They're going to argue that your discovery of Marcus's crimes was too convenient, too perfectly timed. They'll claim I fed you information designed to turn you against him." Victoria considered this, her mind working through the legal implications. "Then we give them something they can't argue with. Something that proves Marcus's guilt independently of anything I might have told the prosecutors." "What do you have in mind?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time since this ordeal began, it was a smile with genuine calculation behind it. "Marcus doesn't know that I know about your real business holdings. As far as he's concerned, I'm still the naive sister who got swept up in a federal investigation." She was right. Marcus had been in federal custody for months, isolated from outside information except for carefully monitored communications with his lawyers. He had no way of knowing that Victoria had discovered my true financial position. "He's going to try to contact me eventually," Victoria continued, "either directly or through intermediaries. When he does, I'll be ready." I felt a surge of pride watching Victoria plan her strategy. This was the sister I'd always hoped she could become. Intelligent, purposeful, fighting for something larger than her own immediate gratification. "It's dangerous," I warned. "If Marcus realizes you're gathering evidence against him, he might try to hurt you." "He already did hurt me," Victoria replied. "He convinced me to betray my family, manipulated me into stealing from my own grandmother, and used my love as a weapon against everyone I cared about. The least I can do is make sure he faces the consequences." Over the next few hours, we worked together to develop a strategy for Victoria's upcoming testimony. The prosecutors would need to demonstrate that her cooperation was genuine and independent, not the result of my manipulation. Victoria would have to convince a jury that her discoveries about Marcus had led to authentic remorse and a genuine desire for justice. But more importantly, we prepared for the possibility that Marcus would attempt to contact her directly. His lawyers might try to arrange a meeting, hoping to either intimidate her into changing her testimony or gather evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. "If he tries to see you," I said, "you need to be prepared for him to use every emotional weapon he has. He'll apologize, declare his love, blame external pressures for his behavior. He might even try to convince you that I'm the real villain in this situation." Victoria nodded grimly. I've seen his manipulation techniques before. The difference is that now I know what to look for. My secure phone rang, David calling with updates on Marcus's legal maneuvering. His new defense strategy was more sophisticated than we'd anticipated, involving claims of prosecutorial misconduct and selective enforcement. They were arguing that Marcus had been targeted because of his relationship with Victoria, not because of any crimes he'd actually committed. They're requesting access to all surveillance records, David reported. They want to know exactly how the evidence against Marcus was gathered and by whom. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since the investigation began. Every piece of evidence had been obtained through legal channels, every surveillance record properly documented. My private investigators had been careful to operate within the bounds of the law, even when Marcus's behavior had made more aggressive tactics tempting. Give them everything, I said, surprising both David and Victoria. Full transparency. Let them examine every document, every recording, every piece of evidence we've collected. Victoria looked at me with surprise. Every piece of evidence against Marcus was gathered legally and ethically. His crimes are documented through his own actions, not through any manipulation on our part. The decision to provide complete transparency was strategic. Marcus's lawyers expected resistance, expected claims of privilege, and demands for protective orders. By giving them everything they asked for, we would demonstrate confidence in our evidence while forcing them to confront the overwhelming documentation of their client's guilt. There's something else, David continued. The asset recovery team has located Marcus's offshore accounts. The total recovered is going to be significantly more than the original estimates. This was welcome news. Marcus had been more successful in his criminal enterprise than even our thorough investigation had revealed. The additional recovered funds would more than compensate our family for the emotional and financial damage his scheme had caused. How much more? Victoria asked. Nearly $5 million, David replied. It appears Marcus and Torres had been running their scheme for longer than we initially discovered, with more victims and more successful extractions. Victoria's face went white. $5 million. Emma, that means Marcus was planning to steal $5 million from our family, not just Nana's inheritance. Actually, I said, pulling up financial projections on my laptop, based on the timeline Torres provided to prosecutors, Marcus was planning a 10-year strategy. Your inheritance was just the beginning. He would have moved on to our parents' assets, then gradually worked his way into my business holdings. The scope of Marcus's ambitions was staggering. He hadn't just been planning a quick score, he'd been designing a decade-long systematic extraction of wealth from our entire family tree. 10 years, Victoria repeated, understanding finally settling over her. He was planning to spend 10 years gradually destroying our family's financial security. While convincing you that he loved you, I added, while making you complicit in your own family's destruction. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing the full magnitude of what Marcus had planned for her life. Not just theft, but a decade of psychological manipulation designed to turn her into a willing accomplice in her family's destruction. I need to do more than just testify, she said finally. I need to make sure everyone understands exactly what he is and what he was planning to do. I smiled, recognizing the determination in her voice. This was no longer about revenge or even justice. This was about Victoria choosing to become someone better than the person Marcus had tried to turn her into. Then let's make sure his lawyers get more than they bargained for, I said, opening files that would give them complete documentation of their client's criminal enterprise. After all, the truth was the most powerful weapon we had, and Victoria was finally ready to wield it. The call came at 2:17 a.m., exactly as I'd predicted it would. Victoria's phone buzzed on her nightstand, a number she didn't recognize, but one that my monitoring systems immediately identified as belonging to Marcus's new legal team. Victoria, the voice was smooth, professional. This is attorney Patricia Holbrook. I represent Marcus Blackwell. I'm sorry to call so late, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Victoria sat up in bed, her eyes meeting mine across the room. We'd been sleeping in shifts for the past week, waiting for this exact contact. Marcus's desperation was finally reaching the point where his lawyers would risk direct communication. What kind of situation? Victoria asked, activating the recording app we'd installed on her phone. There's been a development in Marcus's case. New evidence has come to light that suggests he may have been manipulated by someone close to your family. We need to meet with you as soon as possible to discuss your testimony and ensure you haven't been coerced into making false statements. The approach was clever. They weren't directly accusing me of misconduct, but they were planting seeds of doubt about Victoria's motivations. They wanted her to question whether her cooperation with the prosecution had been genuine or the result of my influence. "I've told the truth about everything," Victoria replied, following the script we'd rehearsed. "I don't understand what you mean by manipulation." "Miss Morrison, I think you'll find our conversation very enlightening. Can you meet us tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock at our offices?" Victoria agreed to the meeting, and after ending the call, we spent the next hour reviewing our strategy. This was the opportunity we'd been waiting for, a chance to turn Marcus's own lawyers into evidence gatherers for the prosecution. "Remember," I said, helping Victoria adjust the nearly invisible recording device we'd obtained through legal channels, "they're going to try to convince you that I've been controlling your decisions. They might even suggest that you've been a victim of my manipulation rather than Marcus's." Victoria smiled grimly. "The irony is that they're not entirely wrong. You have been guiding my decisions. The difference is that you've been guiding me toward the truth, not away from it." The next morning, Victoria arrived at the law offices of Holbrook, Martinez and Associates, dressed in the same conservative style she'd adopted since her world collapsed. She looked like a vulnerable witness, someone who might be susceptible to pressure or persuasion. Through the hidden cameras in her jewelry, technology my security team had borrowed from law enforcement, I watched the meeting unfold from my office. Patricia Holbrook was indeed skilled, employing a combination of sympathy and subtle intimidation that had probably worked on other witnesses. "Victoria," Holbrook began, gesturing to a chair across from her polished desk, "I want you to know that we understand how difficult this situation has been for you. You've been through tremendous trauma, and it's natural that you might have been influenced by people who claim to have your best interests at heart." The opening was textbook witness intimidation, designed to make Victoria question her own perceptions and motivations. But Victoria had spent months in therapy working through exactly these kinds of psychological manipulations. "I'm not sure what you mean," Victoria replied innocently. "Everyone has been very supportive. Your sister, for instance. Emma has been remarkably generous during your crisis, hasn't she? Paying for your legal representation, housing you in her home, guiding you through the prosecution process." Victoria nodded. "She's been wonderful. I don't know what I would have done without her. And I'm sure you feel very grateful to her. Grateful enough, perhaps, to tell prosecutors what you think she wants to hear." The suggestion was delivered with surgical precision, but Victoria was ready for it. "I told prosecutors the truth about what Marcus did and what I did. Emma didn't tell me what to say. She didn't need to. The truth speaks for itself." Holbrook's expression shifted slightly, recognizing that her standard approach wasn't working. She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk between them. "Victoria, we've been investigating your sister's business dealings. Did you know that Emma owns a network of companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars? That she's been operating under false identities for years, building an empire while letting your family believe she was struggling?" This was the moment we'd been preparing for. Marcus's lawyers had done their homework and discovered my true financial position. Now they were trying to use that information to undermine Victoria's credibility. "I found out recently," Victoria replied calmly. "Emma explained that she keeps her business dealings private for security reasons." "Security reasons?" Holbrook leaned forward. "Victoria, your sister has been manipulating your family for years. She let your grandmother worry about her financial stability while she was secretly worth more than your entire inheritance. She allowed you to feel guilty about your grandmother's will while she could have bought and sold that penthouse 10 times over. The accusations were designed to reframe my behavior as deceptive and manipulative, to make Victoria question everything she thought she understood about our relationship. But Victoria had already worked through these revelations and reached her own conclusions." "Emma kept her privacy," Victoria said simply. "That's not the same thing as manipulation. She never asked anyone for money or sympathy. She never pretended to be something she wasn't. But she did pretend," Holbrook pressed. "She pretended to be a struggling consultant when she was actually a corporate mogul. She let Marcus target your family based on false information about your collective wealth." "Marcus targeted our family because he's a criminal," Victoria replied, her voice hardening. "Emma's business success doesn't excuse theft and fraud." I smiled, watching Victoria deflect each attack with growing confidence. She was learning to distinguish between legitimate criticism and manipulation, to separate truth from strategic narrative building. Holbrook tried a different approach. "Victoria, we have evidence that your sister's private investigators have been surveilling Marcus for over a year. She knew about his relationship with you before you ever told your family about the engagement." This was new information and potentially damaging. If Marcus's lawyers could prove that I'd been investigating him before Victoria announced their relationship, they might be able to argue that the entire prosecution was the result of a personal vendetta rather than legitimate law enforcement. But Victoria handled the revelation perfectly. So Emma was protecting our family from a criminal before we even knew we were in danger? That sounds like good sense, not misconduct. She was building a case against a man you loved, Holbrook countered. She was planning to destroy your relationship before it really began. She was planning to protect us from someone who was planning to destroy our lives, Victoria shot back. Would you prefer that she had let Marcus steal everything before taking action? The meeting continued for another hour, with Holbrook trying various angles to undermine Victoria's testimony and paint me as the real manipulator in the situation. But Victoria had been thoroughly prepared, and more importantly, she now understood the difference between protection and predation. Finally, Holbrook played her last card. Victoria, Marcus wants to see you. He says there are things you need to know about your sister, things that will change how you see this entire situation. This was what we'd been waiting for. Marcus's desperation finally reaching the point where he'd risk direct contact with his primary victim. The meeting would be monitored by law enforcement, providing additional evidence of his ongoing attempts to manipulate witnesses. I'll consider it, Victoria said, though we'd already decided she would accept. After leaving the law office, Victoria returned to my apartment where we reviewed the recording together. Marcus's lawyers had revealed more about their defense strategy than they'd probably intended, giving us insight into how they plan to attack the prosecution's case. They're going to argue that you've been the puppet master all along, Victoria said, summarizing what we'd learned, that Marcus was just a small-time con artist who got caught up in your larger game of family manipulation. It's not a bad strategy, I admitted. If they can convince a jury that I'm the real villain, they might be able to create reasonable doubt about Marcus's guilt, except for one problem, Victoria said with satisfaction. I'm not going to let them use me as a weapon against you. Not anymore. The next day, we met with the prosecution team to discuss the defense's latest maneuvers. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez was concerned but not panicked. She'd been expecting Marcus's lawyers to try desperate measures as the trial date approached. They're fishing, Martinez explained, reviewing recordings of Victoria's meeting with Holbrook. They know their client is guilty, so they're trying to muddy the waters by attacking the investigation process. Will it work? Victoria asked. Not if we stay focused on the evidence, Martinez replied. Marcus's crimes are documented through his own actions, not through any investigation your sister might have conducted. The fraud speaks for itself. But there was still the matter of Marcus's request for a meeting with Victoria. The prosecution team was divided on whether to allow it. The risk of witness intimidation was high, but the potential value of recording Marcus's latest manipulation attempts was significant. It's my choice, Victoria said firmly, and I choose to meet with him. I want him to understand exactly what he's lost and why he's going to prison. The meeting was arranged for the following week, in a monitored room at the Federal Detention Center. Victoria would be accompanied by a federal marshal and equipped with recording devices that would capture every word of their conversation. In the days leading up to the meeting, Victoria prepared intensively. She studied transcripts of Marcus's previous interrogations, reviewed his psychological profile, and practiced responding to various manipulation techniques he might employ. He's going to try to make you feel guilty, I warned during one of our preparation sessions. He'll claim that your testimony is destroying an innocent man, that your cooperation with the prosecution is motivated by revenge rather than justice. Let him try, Victoria replied. I know exactly what he is now, and I know exactly what he did to our family. The morning of the meeting, Victoria dressed carefully in a business suit that projected confidence and authority. She looked nothing like the broken woman who'd moved into my guest room months earlier, and everything like someone who'd found her strength through surviving betrayal. Are you ready for this? I asked as we drove to the detention center. I've been ready since the day I realized what he really was, Victoria replied. The only question is whether he's ready for what I've become. The Federal Detention Center was a fortress of concrete and steel, designed to contain the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. Marcus was being held in a minimum security section, but the facility's atmosphere was still intimidating, exactly the environment that might make a vulnerable witness reconsider their testimony. Victoria showed no signs of intimidation as we passed through security. She walked with purpose, her recording equipment hidden beneath her professional attire, her mind focused on the task ahead. Remember, the federal marshal accompanying her said as they approached the meeting room, If you feel unsafe at any point, just say coffee and we'll end the meeting immediately. Victoria nodded, but I could see in her eyes that she had no intention of backing down. This was her chance to confront the man who'd nearly destroyed her life, and she was determined to make the most of it. Through the security monitors, I watched as Marcus was brought into the room. 3 months in federal custody had changed him. He looked thinner, older, less confident than the charming predator who'd seduced my sister, but his eyes still held calculation, still searched for weaknesses he could exploit. "Victoria," he said as soon as he saw her, his voice carrying all the warmth and affection he'd once used to manipulate her emotions. "Thank God you came. I've been so worried about you." Victoria took her seat across from him, separated by a metal table that represented the gulf between his situation and hers. "Hello, Marcus. You look different." "Prison changes a man," he replied, clearly hoping to evoke sympathy. "But seeing you makes everything bearable." "Victoria, there are things you need to know about what's really happening here." And with those words, Marcus began what would be his final attempt to manipulate the woman whose love he'd weaponized against her own family. But this time, Victoria was ready for him. This time she was the hunter, and he was the prey. "You look beautiful," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same intimate tone that had once made Victoria's heart race. "Even in this place, even after everything that's happened, you still take my breath away." Victoria studied the man across from her, noting how federal detention had stripped away his polished veneer. Without his expensive suits and confident swagger, Marcus looked ordinary, just another criminal trying to charm his way out of consequences. "Thank you," she replied neutrally, giving him nothing to work with. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes searching her face for signs of the vulnerable woman he'd manipulated so expertly. "Victoria, I need you to understand something. Everything they're saying about me, all these charges, it's not what it looks like." "Really?" Victoria's voice remained calm, professional, then explain to me what it actually is. "I was trying to protect you," Marcus said, his voice gaining the passionate intensity he'd once used to convince her of his love. "Your sister has been planning this for months, maybe years. She's been manipulating you, using you to get to me because she couldn't stand that you'd found happiness." The accusation was delivered with perfect sincerity, and Victoria could see why it might have worked on the woman she'd been 6 months ago. But that woman no longer existed. "Emma manipulated me into stealing from our grandmother?" Victoria asked quietly. "She manipulated me into seducing my sister's fiancé?" Marcus faltered for just a moment, recognizing the trap he'd walked into. "No, that's not." "Victoria, what happened between us was real. It was the only real thing in this entire situation." "Was it real when you were meeting with Vincent Torres to plan how to drain my family's assets? Was it real when you were researching my father's business accounts? Was it real when you convinced me to give you access to Nana's financial information?" Each question hit its mark, and Victoria could see Marcus recalibrating his approach. The recordings from his meetings with Torres had been devastating, providing clear evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," Marcus said, switching to a strategy of shared victimhood. "Torres had information about my past, things that could have destroyed my career. He was blackmailing me into helping him. So you decided to destroy my family instead?" "I was trying to find a way out that wouldn't hurt you," Marcus insisted. "Everything I did was to protect what we had together." Victoria almost laughed at the audacity of the lie. The man who'd systematically planned to rob her family blind was claiming it had all been for her benefit. "Marcus," she said, her voice taking on a tone of gentle patience that masked steel underneath, "I've seen the financial records. I know about the offshore accounts, the previous families you and Torres targeted, the 10-year plan to extract wealth from everyone I care about. You weren't protecting me. You were using me." Marcus's facade cracked slightly, revealing the desperation beneath. "Those records are fabricated. Your sister has the resources to create whatever evidence she needs. She's been planning to destroy me since the day you told her about our engagement." "Actually," Victoria said, pulling out a folder that made Marcus's face go pale, "Emma didn't need to fabricate anything. Would you like to see what I found when I went through your personal belongings?" The folder contained documents that Victoria had discovered during the federal raid, papers Marcus had hidden in his apartment that detailed his research into multiple families, including detailed financial profiles and psychological assessments of potential targets. "This is your handwriting, isn't it?" Victoria asked, showing him a page labeled Morrison Family Asset Analysis. The one where you estimated the total extractable wealth at $15 million over 10 years. Marcus stared at the document, his mind clearly racing for an explanation that might salvage the situation. Victoria, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, she interrupted. You identified my family as a target worth $15 million. You researched each of us individually to determine the best approach. You decided I was the most vulnerable entry point because of my jealousy toward Emma. She turned to another page in the folder. This psychological profile is fascinating. Subject demonstrates significant insecurity regarding family position and financial status, likely to respond well to validation and romantic attention. Previous relationship patterns suggest susceptibility to emotional manipulation. Marcus had gone completely white. The documents Victoria was quoting from were his own private notes, never intended for anyone else to see. You studied me like a lab rat, Victoria continued, her voice remaining steady despite the pain of reading her own vulnerabilities laid out so clinically. You identified my weaknesses and designed a strategy to exploit them. Victoria, please. I'm not finished. Victoria's voice cut through his attempt to interrupt. This timeline is particularly interesting. Phase 1, establish romantic relationship and gain subject's trust. Phase 2, obtain access to elderly relatives' finances through subject's influence. Phase 3, begin systematic extraction while maintaining romantic facade. She looked up from the documents to meet his eyes. We never made it to Phase 4, did we? That's where you would have convinced me to give you power of attorney and then disappeared with everything. Marcus slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his manipulation tactics were powerless against someone who'd seen the blueprint of his deception. The woman you fell in love with never existed, Victoria said quietly. You created a version of me that would serve your purposes. Grateful, insecure, desperate for validation, but that woman is gone now. Who are you then? Marcus asked, his voice hollow with defeat. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since entering the room, it was genuine. I'm the person Emma always believed I could become. I'm someone who chooses truth over comfortable lies, justice over personal comfort, family over the approval of strangers. Your sister destroyed us, Marcus said, making one final attempt to shift blame. No, Victoria replied firmly. You destroyed us the moment you decided to target my family. Emma just made sure there were consequences. The meeting ended shortly afterward, with Marcus led back to his cell, and Victoria escorted to the waiting area where I was reviewing the recordings with the prosecution team. Her performance had been flawless, calm, prepared, and devastatingly effective. How do you feel? I asked as we drove home. Free, Victoria said simply. For the first time in months, completely free. The trial began 3 weeks later. Marcus's defense team, armed with their knowledge of my business empire and their theories about manipulation, tried desperately to shift focus away from their client's crimes. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Victoria's testimony was unshakable. She described her relationship with Marcus with clinical precision, explaining how he'd identified and exploited her insecurities. She detailed her manipulation of our grandmother with unflinching honesty, accepting responsibility for her role while making clear that Marcus had encouraged and guided her actions. Most powerfully, she read from Marcus's own documents, his psychological profiles, his financial projections, his strategic timelines. By the time she finished, the jury understood exactly what they were dealing with. Not a romantic relationship gone wrong, but a calculated criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable families. Marcus was convicted on all counts. Vincent Torres, facing similar charges, had already pleaded guilty and received a 20-year sentence. Marcus's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. The will contest resolved more quietly. Faced with Victoria's own testimony about how she'd manipulated our grandmother, the probate court invalidated the codicil that had given her the entire inheritance. The estate was redistributed according to Nana's original will, split equally between Victoria and me. But by then, the money mattered less than the principle. The inheritance that had once represented everything Victoria thought she wanted had become a symbol of her growth and redemption. I want to donate my half to charity, Victoria told me as we sat in the probate attorney's office, reviewing the final settlement documents. Are you sure? I asked, though I wasn't surprised by her decision. I stole it once, Victoria said simply. I won't benefit from it now, even legally, but maybe some good can come from Nana's money after all. The charity she chose was particularly appropriate. an organization that provided legal assistance to elderly people facing financial exploitation. It was Victoria's way of honoring the grandmother she'd wronged while ensuring that other families wouldn't face the same predation. Marcus's sentencing hearing was packed with victims from his previous schemes, families whose lives he'd damaged in pursuit of wealth that was never rightfully his. Victoria testified again, this time as part of the victim impact statements. "The man sitting at that table stole more than money from my family," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "He stole our trust, our security, and our peace of mind. But most importantly, he stole time, precious months with our grandmother that were clouded by manipulation and lies." She paused, her voice gaining strength. "But he also gave me something valuable, though he never intended to. He showed me what I was capable of becoming when I chose deception over truth, manipulation over honesty. He showed me a version of myself that I never want to be again." Marcus received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. With good behavior, he might be released in his 60s, an old man whose prime years had been consumed by the consequences of his choices. As we left the courthouse for the final time, Victoria and I walked past the same news crews that had documented Marcus's arrest months earlier. But this time, Victoria didn't hide from the cameras or avoid the questions. She spoke briefly about the importance of families protecting each other and the value of facing consequences with dignity. "What's next for you?" a reporter asked. Victoria smiled. "I'm starting law school in the fall. I want to help other families avoid what happened to us." It was perfect. The woman who'd once been a victim of legal manipulation would become an advocate for its prevention. The sister who'd stolen from her own family would spend her career protecting others from similar betrayals. That evening, we had dinner at the restaurant where Victoria and I had shared our last meal before her engagement announcement, a lifetime ago, when we were different people living different lives. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked over dessert. "The way you handled everything? You could have just exposed Marcus from the beginning and saved us all a lot of pain." I considered the question seriously. If I had exposed him immediately, would you have believed me? Or would you have chosen to trust him over family? Victoria was quiet for a moment. Honestly, considering the alternative timeline, I probably would have believed him, she admitted. I was so invested in the fairy tale that I would have dismissed any evidence as jealousy or manipulation. "Then no," I said. "I don't regret giving you the chance to discover the truth yourself, to make your own choices about what kind of person you wanted to be. Even though it meant watching me hurt our family, watching me steal from Nana and betray you, especially because of that," I replied. "You needed to understand the full consequences of those choices. You needed to experience what it felt like to be manipulated so you'd recognize it in the future." Victoria nodded slowly. "And now? Now you're the sister I always hoped you could become. Someone who chooses difficult truths over comfortable lies. Someone who takes responsibility for her mistakes instead of making excuses for them." As we walked home through the city streets, I reflected on the journey we'd both traveled. 9 months ago, Victoria had been a woman consumed by jealousy and entitlement, willing to betray family for personal gain. Marcus had been a predator moving freely through society, targeting vulnerable families with impunity. Now Marcus was in federal prison, his criminal enterprise dismantled, and his victims compensated. Victoria was transformed, no longer the insecure woman who'd needed external validation, but someone who'd found strength through surviving betrayal and choosing redemption. The inheritance that had started this entire conflict had been donated to help other families avoid similar predation. Our grandmother's legacy was no longer a source of division between us, but a foundation for protecting others from the kind of manipulation that had nearly destroyed us. Most importantly, Victoria and I had found our way back to being sisters, not the superficial relationship we'd maintained during her engagement, but something deeper and more honest. We'd been forged by crisis into people who could trust each other completely because we'd seen each other at their worst and chosen to build something better. "Emma," Victoria said as we reached my apartment building, "thank you." "For what?" "For believing I could be better than I was," she replied. "For saving me from Marcus, yes, but more than that, for saving me from myself." As we rode the elevator up to the apartment that had become our shared home, I thought about the nature of justice and redemption. Marcus had received the legal consequences he deserved, but Victoria had received something more valuable, the opportunity to become someone worthy of forgiveness. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't just about destroying your enemies. It was about building something better from the wreckage they left behind. Victoria's transformation from predator to protector was worth more than any punishment I could have inflicted. After all, justice without redemption is just vengeance. But justice with redemption, that's how broken families become whole again, how trust is rebuilt from betrayal, and how sisters find their way back to each other despite everything that tried to tear them apart. The game was over, and everyone had gotten exactly what they deserved. Marcus had his consequences, Victoria had her redemption, and I had my sister back, not the one I'd lost to manipulation and jealousy, but the one she'd chosen to become through courage and truth. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming better than the people who tried to destroy you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to help the people you love become better too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.